Joseph, shall we start? Hold on, you muted. There
you go. Can you hear me now? Perfect. Thank you very much. So thank you, Jordan, for this very important webinar on the role of social protection in supporting Africa's response to climate change. Thanks for giving me the opportunity to make some opening remarks on this topic, which I hold dear to my heart. But before I start, let me begin by acknowledging and thanking the funders of this project, CEDA, who have been supporting this work that Jordan and her team have put together. And CEDA has also been supporting a lot of work that SAIA is undertaking, and we're so grateful for the impact that this work is doing and for the continued support by CEDA. I also want to thank the organizing team for this webinar, for putting this together and inviting what looks like a very distinguished panel to take us through this very important issue. We all know that climate change is a big problem, is a big issue, especially for low-income countries and developing countries, and that climate change is affecting, disproportionately affecting people in developing countries, Africa included, and social protection is one tool that can be used to address some of the negative impacts that climate change is causing. We have, over the last couple of years, we have seen the intensity of climate disasters increasing, and not just the intensity, but the size of those disasters also increasing. We have seen droughts in the Horn of Africa, for example. We have seen floods. I think here in South Africa, we've had, is it 2 in the last four years or so in KZN. We've seen cyclones like Cyclone Idai and Cyclone Freddy, which affected Malawi, Mozambique, and other countries in the southern and eastern part of Africa. And all these disasters have taken a lot of lives, destroyed a lot of property, destroyed a lot of livelihoods, displaced a lot of people, and generally pushed many marginalized people deeper into poverty. It's not just these sudden impacts. We also have the slow onset climate events, if I can call it that, taking place. Desertification, sea level rises, the disappearance of water resources. All these are taking place gradually, and we're seeing the impacts of this. Not to mention the health effects of climate change, like malaria, increased malaria, and cholera. All those, they keep, they are manifestations of how serious the climate problem is. And unfortunately, for most low-income countries and developing countries, this means that we need more and more resources to take care of these problems, to help people adapt to the climate problems, to climate shocks, and also, of course, to try to mitigate this climate change, so that we don't see more and more of this type of shocks. But with these resources that are needed, again, unfortunately, for most of the low-income countries, we have to look outside. We depend on external support to get us through these climatic shocks, which puts us in a very, very vulnerable position, because when you depend on external support, you have no control over this, and you have to just hope that adequate support will be provided to you. The other unfortunate thing is that when you look at this support that is coming from external actors, from countries, developed countries, to be precise, you find that it's a bit misaligned with not just the needs of these countries, but also with in terms of who actually need the resources the most. Research by OECD has shown that 70% of all climate financing that is provided to vulnerable countries and low-income countries goes to middle-income countries, meaning that the remaining 30% is the one that goes to the low-income countries. And this, in our own research at SAIA, we have shown that the least resilient countries tend to receive on average $10 per person for climate change adaptation, while the more resilient ones, they receive about double that, about only $2 per person, which just shows that countries need to adopt locally driven climate financing, and so that they are able to address the climate change problems locally. And this brings into question on whether we can use social protection. We can make it aligned to climate change, so that social protection is also being used effectively as a tool for addressing climate change. So this is the topic that we have today, and the panel that have been assembled will dwell into this, and I hope that we are going to have we're going to listen attentively, and we're going to have a very, very, very productive discussion. So with these few remarks, let me hand over to our moderator, the capable hands of my colleague Jordan McLean, to take us through this session. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Joseph. Let me just spotlight myself. Thank you so much for opening today's discussion on the role of social protection in Africa's policy response to climate change, for providing a lot of those contextual details that really frame the discussion we're about to start today. For those that don't know me, my name is Jordan McLean. I'm a researcher in the Climate and Natural Resources Program at SAIA. This conversation, as Joseph has mentioned, is part of a continuation and extension of SAIA's existing work on climate and the development nexus. Climate change poses an incredible threat to Africa's development and the timely achievement of Agenda 2063. I mean, various risk reports, as well as SAIA's own measuring of economic vulnerability to shocks, shows that the continent is particularly vulnerable to climate change and needs climate-proofed economic and social policy to protect the livelihoods and well-being of its growing population. An estimated 130 million people globally will be pushed into poverty in the absence of ambitious climate change mitigation and adaptation policies. From the global stocktake that we saw last year, it's also clear that meeting the 1.5 degrees Celsius goal is becoming increasingly unlikely. Already, climate impacts that are not avoided through adaptation measures and mitigation measures are culminating in an increased frequency in climate disaster, just as Joseph mentioned. These devastate poor and vulnerable communities on the continent and in the developing world disproportionately. The progress that we had seen at COP27 and COP28 on loss and damage has not adequately responded to nor kept pace with the growing need for loss and damage finance in the global south. The African Union is aware of all of these layers of risk, urgency, and vulnerability. The AU's comprehensive climate change and resilient development strategy and action plan, as well as points in the second 10-year implementation plan of Agenda 2063, both call on member states to develop and strengthen their social protection systems to protect the most vulnerable communities from poverty, inequality, and climate change, which exacerbates this reality. For those that are joining us today that are perhaps less familiar with the terminology, a simple definition from the ILO describes social protection as a mix of policies that aim to reduce poverty and inequality. Poor and vulnerable households currently bear the brunt of climate change in Africa. They are typically reliant on natural resource-based incomes such as farming and fishing, which are already incredibly threatened by climate change. Social protection is not a new policy response to unpredictable economic shocks, such as those that arise from climate change. The onset of the COVID-19 pandemic saw a near global disbursement of emergency funds to support citizens in trying and changing times. Social protection now is receiving even more attention because of its climate resilience building potential, which is what our panelists will be speaking to today. States can use social protection preemptively to improve people's capacity to deal with climate impacts, but also as a countermeasure to lessen some of the harmful effects of climate crisis. Despite this utility of social protection in addressing climate and inequality, in addressing poverty and inequality, even as climate change exacerbates these issues, the ILO has stated that social protection coverage for the continent is only at 17.4% compared to the global average of 46.9%. They have indicated that the new social protection report will be coming out very soon this year, and that there's been a slight improvement on these stats, but the disparity between Africa and the global average is just too large. Now, even when we take national and regional adaptation measures into account, it must be noted that analysis from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change last year found that adaptation strategies don't directly tackle poverty and inequality, which are both exacerbated by climate change. So a convergence of climate policy and social policy is therefore possible through climate-sensitive social protection, and it needs to be seriously considered by policymakers on the continent. Climate-resilient development must include social protection measures to protect those most impacted by climate change and the economic consequences of climate change. Now, this low coverage rate of 17.4% for the continent should not cause us to lose hope completely. There are innovative initiatives on the continent that can be used as policy lessons for other countries that are looking to develop climate resilience of their own social protection systems, or who are looking to vastly expand and implement social protection policies. An often cited example, which SAIA has looked at as well, is Ethiopia's Productive Safety Net Program, the PSNP. Although it's not intended as a climate response measure, the program has had some very interesting results. Most participants of the program come from drought risk regions, and through the program, they receive cash or food in exchange for participating in public works programs. Now, these public works programs involve building and maintaining water and soil conservation projects, or building up community infrastructure that is sorely needed, like schools and hospitals. They provide food and income sources that are more predictable, while also building climate-resistant infrastructure. The AU has also established a special agency to improve member states' capacity to prepare for climate disaster and disease outbreaks. This is the African Risk Capacity that have joined us today, where they will discuss their mandate on the continent and their role in providing risk transfer and reinsurance services to member states. But the chief challenge to realize comprehensive and climate-sensitive social protection systems in Africa, from our research, is the lack of appropriate finance. Now, taxation typically can fund national social protection systems, while there is the presence of international humanitarian aid throughout the continent that has usually been a more prominent source of financial support. But it's time now for alternative and innovative sources of finance, as well as a strong political commitment to build up social protection to make an impact on the future of Africa's development trajectory. The aim of this webinar, as Joseph has already stated, is to present some arguments into the importance of utilizing all policy options to improve resilience to climate change, especially for Africa. The continent remains the most vulnerable region and has the lowest coverage rates of social protection globally. This is the reality. But as Africa implements its continental climate strategy, it's important to unpack the role that social protection can play in protecting livelihoods and economies from climate shocks, such as the effects of loss and damage. Today's panelists will take us through the current discourse around social protection as a climate response measure. I want to just let all of the attendees know that the Q&A function is open, so you are welcome to pose your comments, your questions in the Q&A function, or to pose any comments in the chat section as well. And now, without delaying too much, I'll now hand over to our first speaker, Teresa Anderson. She is the climate lead at ActionAid and has actually recently returned from the Bonn International meeting with the UNFCCC. Teresa, if you don't mind, please can you take us through your publication entitled Avoiding the Climate Poverty Spiral? It calls for an international agenda to scale up climate-proof social protection systems. It argues that social protection strengthens resilience and protects vulnerable communities affected by climate change. So just please give us a run through of the publication. What is social protection as well? And how does it address the adverse effects of climate change? Thank you.
Thanks very much, Jordan, and thank you so much for the opportunity to share this discussion, for hosting this discussion. I'm really glad that you're flagging social protection as an important strategy to address climate change, because I think it really deserves a central spot in the discourse. We produced this report, Avoiding the Climate Poverty Spiral, several years ago, but I think it's still very relevant, in fact, more than ever as the climate crisis escalates. Sorry, I'm just trying to, there we go. So I hope that this is showing nicely.
Yes.
Okay, great, thank you. So first of all, I mean, as you've already discussed, the climate impacts are escalating. You know, we're seeing erratic rainfall patterns, droughts. Of course, this is affecting crop yields for farmers who make up the majority of the economy of African nations. But as you mentioned, you know, much of Africa's coastline also depends very much on fishing as an income, and the warming seas are really affecting fishing stocks. All farming communities are reporting changes, and because it is believed that as the seas warm, the water, the movements of the seas change, and the fish start to move away because they cannot cope with warmer water temperature changes. We've seen around the world, but you know, increasingly now in Southeast Africa, Southern Africa, cyclones, you know, really causing massive floods, and we've seen massive floods also recently in East Africa. All of this is causing massive displacement, loss of homes, and of course, loss of income. Now, increasingly, we're seeing rising sea levels. So Senegal, of course, has a lot of islands which are becoming increasingly solidified from rising sea levels disappearing under the waves. And now we're seeing many more heat waves really striking this year. It's been, I mean, today the news about the absolutely appalling deaths in Mecca at the Hajj, you know, hundreds of people dying because of heat waves. But, you know, last week, Sudan and India, hundreds of people dying. Last month, terrible heat waves in Southeast Asia. So these are becoming very severe. Of course, loss of life, but of course, loss of income, because people just simply cannot work out in the fields in these conditions. And so we have the term loss and damage, which is used to describe when, in spite of all the efforts we make to mitigate, i.e. to reduce the emissions we're producing into the atmosphere, or to adapt, i.e. to become more resilient to what comes, climate impacts are still hitting us, still causing losses, for example, to crops, to income, to land, or damage to homes and infrastructure. So loss and damage is a term that we use to describe things that we lose, or things that are damaged and that we have to pay to repair. But with all these impacts of climate change, women are affected the most. Women and girls are affected in particular ways. Nearly half of the agricultural workforce in Asia and sub-Saharan Africa are women. But women tend to have, additional burdens of care on top of their farming responsibilities. So they're taking care of the family, of the young, the elderly. They're providing food. They're the ones fetching firewood. They're the ones fetching water. All of that becomes more difficult, particularly providing food and water when climate change is happening. But in spite of all those extra burdens they have on top of their farming responsibilities, there are just systemic barriers, gender blind or gender biased policies, for example, that prevent women from accessing land, prevent women from accessing finance. Many countries' farming extension services only provide those services to male farmers and do not provide, farming advice to women farmers, because of a set of assumptions about the kind of products that women grow. Many markets are really only a safe space for men. It's quite difficult for women to access markets in many cases. Often that requires, a high level of numerical education, of confidence, of cultural acceptance, but that all becomes very difficult when you've been the first person, you were taken out of school before your brothers, etc. Decision-making processes, even at community level, let alone at elite level, often ignore women's needs, often really only listen to the needs of elite men in the community or in the country. And so women's needs, for example, very basic needs such as fetching water, making food, firewood, these needs aren't heard at decision-making level. And so people's needs aren't addressed. And then, of course, the lower literacy levels that women often have because they were taken out of school before their brothers just compounds all of this. So this means it's harder for women to find the time, the resources and the knowledge so that they can improve farming and their livelihoods and to strengthen resilience to climate change. So with these inequalities, the more climate change impacts there are, the deepening poverty that women have. And more, we're seeing the feminization of agriculture and women carrying, the entire burden themselves, and this difference and this poverty is deepening for them. So, and of course, this becomes a cycle. Women, as climate change hits, girls are taken out of schools, either to save money for schooling for their brothers or to fetch water and firewood. And then all this leads to women, when climate change hits, women face increased hunger because often they make sure that their husbands and children can eat first, and women are just getting deeper into poverty. And then when the family is going hungry, women also face increased gender-based violence, usually domestically. And then increasingly, we're seeing now with climate change, this is driving migration significantly because it is becoming so difficult to make a living as a farmer. So it is often the men who leave the rural area, go to the cities. Women are left behind by migration, often don't receive much money sent back by their husbands, and so have to carry the burden on their own. Or if they do decide to, make the journey, young women can often be trafficked and face real exploitation and abuse. So this is all leading to a real, what we call a climate poverty spiral, because when a climate disaster hits, or even it could be not something not termed as a climate disaster, but erratic rainfall patterns that mean that you planted when you thought rains were coming, but it was a false start, and so your seeds germinate, but then there's not enough rainfall for them to fully grow and set seed. Even whether minor or major, farmers are really suffering, especially women farmers. So then they fall into this loss of income, often losing a whole season or part of the season's income for that year. If they've had a major disaster, for example, from a flood or a cyclone, then they have additional costs of rebuilding. Then they can't afford to plant for the next season. They get deeper into debt. And then that leads to a deepening cycle of hunger, poverty, and migration. So this is where the social protection comes in. As Jordan touched on, the International Labour Organization defines social protection as a mix of policies and programs that aim to reduce poverty, vulnerability, and inequality throughout the life cycle. So these are to help people make ends meet when life events, shocks, and stresses affect their income. There's a Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the human right to social security. So this recognizes how critical social security really is to help people bridge that gap when disasters happen. There's also Sustainable Development Goal 1.3, which recognize the importance of this, of helping everybody cope with shocks and stresses. And there's also the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, the CEDAW, which also recognizes how vital this is for gender equality. And to be honest, I mean, I recognize that a lot of people don't even realize that almost everybody is benefiting from social protection in some way, but many of us don't realize and haven't even heard that term. But there are all sorts of versions of social protection. For example, income support and cash transfers, which often happen when there are climate disasters, food relief after humanitarian disasters, but also unemployment benefit. Employment guarantees, which are programs that some countries do. India does this a lot. I don't know about South Africa actually, but sort of providing work for people and paying them a salary to undertake works in the public good. But parental leave, that's a form of social protection. Sick pay is a form of social protection. Furlough, that's a word that many countries started to use during the COVID crisis when businesses had to be shut down, but government said, look, we'll give you a basic salary so that the businesses can reopen when the pandemic is more safe. Pensions are a form of social protection. Because people can't work after they hit a certain age, but still need to eat, to pay their rent, to live. Housing support, free school meals are a form of social protection. And these and the employment guarantees that I referred to can be connected to what's called asset building or public works. So, maybe in some places it could be building roads, building schools, building bridges, employment so that people get employed and that the community benefits from those assets. And an expansive interpretation of social protection might even call some public services and some subsidies as a form of social protection as well. So we did this report, Avoiding the Climate Poverty Spiral, which looked at how social protection can really be used to specifically address loss and damage and help people bridge in the climate crisis. So if you think about how if climate impacts have caused reduced income or food insecurity or crop losses or reduced fish catch, you could get the social protection tools that you could use might be income support and cash transfers, Nowadays, if you, sorry, to look at that previous photo, this is an example of a woman who received a cash transfer by mobile phone in Nairobi, because Kenya has that M-Pesa system where people can basically receive cash by phone. Many more countries are doing this now, and that's been a really effective strategy for social protection. But of course, in some places, it is actual cash transfers. Some countries provide minimum price guarantees or replacement school meals, job guarantees, cash for work, or asset building. But then, for example, when there's been damage to homes or infrastructure, people can receive one-off payments for reconstruction. I know in Bangladesh, they have a very strong program to help people with that, which means that people don't go into debt to rebuild their homes. They're able to, you know, bridge that gap and continue. Loss of livelihoods due to sudden or slow onset climate impacts. You can again have job guarantees, asset building, reskilling and retraining, subsidies to help people transfer to new livelihood options, or like sometimes when people are moving into, you know, moving away from, perhaps you lost your farmland because of the rising sea levels. There's a potential to, if you want to find a new type of role, new type of job, livelihood, government can help reskill you and cover your initial losses as you transition to a new job and get to grips with it. There's, of course, humanitarian agencies have seen how displacement to camps as a result of disasters, you know, heavily dependent on food relief, cash transfer, water, shelter, psychosocial support. And then there are other roles when it comes to planned migration or relocation. If we, you know, governments need to start recognizing that and planning to support communities, you know, relocate from islands that are disappearing under the sea. So housing support, training and reskilling, all of that will be very useful. And then there could be very specific types of social protection for people who are left behind by migrating husbands. So there are some key principles that we should be thinking about when applying social protection. It needs to be gender responsive, so recognizing that women have particular needs and there should be specific types of social protection targeted to help women, and that they should be universal, because means testing is often promoted as a way to sort of supposedly target social protection at those who need it most. But there's been a lot of questioning about whether that is in fact the most efficient and effective way of doing it, because means testing requires a lot of infrastructure and surveying to engage people so that they can record their information, and it often leaves out the people who are most vulnerable. So universal social protection is now thought to be a far more efficient way of doing it. Joining up different social protection systems so that basic levels of support can really be connected, and make these systems of social protection shock responsive and able to respond to uncertainty and able to be scaled up. So there's a good example from the Philippines. Several years ago, when Typhoon Haiyan hit, there was a social protection scheme in place, and that was just quickly scaled up when the typhoon hit so that people could get the funds they needed to eat, to rebuild their homes, and to invest quickly in figuring out what they needed to do to save their livelihoods and still have an income the next year. These, of course, should be linked to early warning systems, because we need to know if rains aren't coming this year. The sooner these social protection systems are rolling out plans so that people can bridge that gap is, of course, really important. And making these systems participatory and inclusive, and really listening to the people that need them most so that they can be, you know, tweaked and adjusted. So in conclusion, national climate-proofed, universal, gender-responsive social protection systems should be more widely adopted alongside other adaptation strategies and loss and damage strategies. We can touch on this later in the Q&A, but international climate finance, particularly for loss and damage and adaptation, should be how to, you know, part of the contribution to pay for it. We also know most of the countries most vulnerable to climate change are themselves already in in deep debt. So debt relief would be a really critical way to help those countries find the national resources to pay for the social protection. And there's also a lot of potential with progressive taxation because developing countries, Africa has a lot more potential to increase their taxes. Africa has actually been advocating for a global framework on taxes so that they can raise taxes and get some more revenue to contribute to costs like these. I'll end it there. Thanks very much, and looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you so much, Teresa, for sharing some insights from your report. I think what stood out for me was when you went into explaining what social protection is and sharing some forms of social protection. You mentioned that sometimes people don't even know that they are a recipient of the social protection mechanism. So I think that's extremely important then to also look at next steps for kind of expanding and ramping up social protection coverage. And that's why we've invited our next speaker, Dr. Maria Alexandrova from the German Institute of Sustainability and Development. She is a project lead there and a senior researcher, and she's published extensively on exactly what your last slide looked at. So innovative policy options and utilizing international climate funds to expand and strengthen social protection systems. So I'd like to hand over then to Dr. Alexandrova. You have the floor.
My apologies, Maria, and maybe you can help me, Jordan. I'm struggling to stop the share.
To stop
the screen share. Yeah.
Okay. That's what I can do. It should be maybe at the bottom next to the chat function.
Let me see if this works. That'll do for now, right? Does that stop it?
We can still see your screen. It might just be loading.
Sorry about this.
No, it's okay.
Maybe I can go ahead because I anyway don't have a presentation. Yeah, thank you very much for the invitation. It's been really a pleasure to be able to contribute to this very important discussion, as Teresa also highlighted, and in particular on financing social protection in the context of climate change, because this has been much less discussed so far in both academic and policy discourses. So I was invited to contribute to this event by providing insights on the role of UN climate change funds for supporting social protection, which is actually based on my current research on this topic. And maybe as a start, I'd like to add to what Teresa presented, which was really very comprehensive overview of various social protection instruments. What I'd like to highlight is that in addition to the role of social protection for responding to climate shocks, it is important to acknowledge also the role of social protection to facilitate climate change adaptation and mitigation action. And also the role of national of services, so-called services provided on a collective basis. This means all policies, all set of policies, institutions, and regulations, laws that make possible the effective implementation of any social protection measure, and also the integration of such in various strategies. So traditionally, social protection has been funded mostly through development finance, through humanitarian assistance, and it has been less looking to what role multilateral climate funds could play in supporting social protection. And what has happened in the last few years is, in fact, that social protection has gained recognition in the UN climate change regime. For example, social protection has been acknowledged in the Just Transitions Work Program, in the Global Goal and Adaptation discussions, as well as on loss and damage. And considering that the UN climate funds are mandated to support countries to design and implement climate strategies, it is at the moment a certain momentum to start asking questions. Okay, are the existing UN climate funds fit to provide support for social protection. So this was the main research question, which I have explored together with Professor Lala Ku and my colleague Daniele Malherbe in our recent paper on the Green Climate Fund. So now looking into what links all climate funds established under the UN climate change regime, this includes the Least Developed Countries Fund, the Special Climate Change Fund, both managed by the Global Environment Facility, the Adaptation Fund and the Green Climate Fund, is that all these funds invest in projects with clear climate change objectives that address the needs of the most vulnerable communities, that also contribute to implementation of national climate strategies and plans, and importantly, in alignment with national sustainable development and poverty reduction strategies, where social protection has an important role. And looking into the strategic objectives of all these funds, there are areas where there is a strong link to social protection. This includes early warning systems, developing of climate information services, strengthening institutional capacities, and also knowledge to enable climate action and also catalyze innovation. And now to answer the question of, what would be the role of UN climate funds to support social protection, and I wouldn't call it scaling up social protection coverage, because I think that climate funds, at least currently, cannot really scale up coverage, rather of geographic coverage, rather to strengthen existing systems to be more responsive to climate impacts or eventually promote innovative mechanisms. So there are two ways in which climate finance link to social protection. First, social protection systems can enable climate projects because they offer institutional and policy frameworks that can support the design and implementation of project activities. In addition, existing schemes could serve as instruments to implement project activities in key development sectors addressed by climate change, such as health, disaster risk reduction, food security, and environmental restoration. And I will provide a few examples from the Green Climate Fund. For example, social registries have been used to identify beneficiaries of climate projects, especially in water, food security, and agriculture sectors. We also find projects that create synergies or build upon experience from existing or completed social protection programs. For example, several projects targeted people graduating from social protection programs, and I think this points to a very important role of climate funds in supporting, in linking climate fund support to social protection systems. We also identified a few projects that use existing social protection programs as an instrument to implement mitigation and adaptation activities. For example, in terms of adaptation, there has been projects like Public Works for disaster risk reduction. However, this has been only within the duration of the project. We also identified projects that could be considered to point to the role of social protection to address the risk of maladaptation. We found a project, for example, that used social protection mechanisms to implement water sector reform in response to water scarcity. So I think that's also a very important element of how social protection could be integrated in the portfolio of project climate funds. Now, this was one dimension of the link between climate finance and social protection. Now, the second dimension of these linkages relates to investment in adapting social protection systems to climate change. And this relates particularly to strengthening social protection systems through climate-informed planning and enhanced knowledge and institutional capacities. This also includes projects that could establish innovative social protection mechanisms by transforming existing social protection program or instrument, or designing pilot initiatives that generate knowledge for scaling up and replication. And I will provide again a few examples from the Green Climate Fund. So we found very limited number of projects that invest in adapting social protection systems. But some of them point to potentials for further expansion of this of such interventions. We identified projects that address a wide range of physical climate risks, including both climate extreme and slow onset processes. And they related mainly to building livelihood resilience and food security, enhancing early warning systems and disaster risk reduction, also supporting housing, social housing in urban areas, or promoting climate resilient agricultural systems. When it comes to environmental impacts, slow onset impacts, we identified projects that support rangeland restoration and forest protection through social protection mechanisms, among others. Now, all these projects related to, on the one hand, of strengthening national social protection systems through establishing linkages to climate services and strengthening national capacities, for example, training or developing policy or legal instruments. We also found only 3 projects that support the design or piloting of new social protection schemes. This included 1 project on shock responsive social protection, 1 project on public employment for rangeland restoration, and 1 project on environmental conditional cash transfer. So there is still not enough evidence to understand to what extent social protection can be supported by climate funds, what works and what does not work, because there is, for example, not evaluation of such projects. They're quite new. However, I think the results indicate a number of areas of strength, particularly for the Green Climate Fund. So this relates to first that funding for adapting social protection systems through design of pilot schemes or strengthening institutional capacities is a distinct area where currently the Green Climate Fund has been proven to provide support. Some of these projects also indicate the relevance of the Green Climate Fund to support building activities that build capacities of local institutions, including climate services and shock responsive social protection, which is very much relevant to responding to loss and damage. I would say also that there are certain limitations which we found, very clear limitations. This relate to the fact that all projects that we have identified that invest in social protection, they have received co-financing. Basically, it was clear that the Green Climate Fund does not provide direct budgetary support for social protection beyond strengthening institutional capacities. And there I would see a possible role of a new loss and damage fund that can be used to channel social protection, while other climate funds could be more supportive in strengthening national social protection systems for both mitigation and adaptation action. It is also important to acknowledge that climate funds are not suited to provide long-term finance to sustain social protection systems. So it is very important that projects and any strategic plans developed with the support of climate funds finance should be considered to be well aligned with other sources of finance that could ensure continuation, coordination and coherence with both social protection and climate finance sources. And when it comes to the question of how, I think today the discussion is quite focused also on loss and damage. So I just want to highlight a few areas where I see a continuation of the discussions around the role of loss and damage fund in supporting social protection. So the loss and damage fund is still to be operationalized. So there are many open questions like around the scope, around the instruments, around the access modalities. So it would be very important when it comes to discussing the role of the New Loss and Damage Fund in supporting social protection to look into, first of all, the national level capacities. Because as Jordan mentioned, in the African context, for example, the social protection coverage is still very low. So it is very important to understand who are the providers of social protection, both formal and informal forms of social protection, and how this could be supported by the New Loss and Damage Fund. It is also very important to open the discussion around the coherence and complementarity of all UN climate funds, because, for instance, all of existing funds have in their priorities to strengthen early warning systems, to provide climate services, which is very relevant for loss and damage and for social protection. It is also part of the activities of the scope of the Loss and Damage Fund as per the decision agreed at COP28. However, it is very important to better understand where funding will be more effective, where access to funding for such activities would be most effective, and to better place then the role of social protection in these discussions around coherence and complementarity. And the last point I would like to make is that it's also that there are various levels where social protection can be integrated in climate funds. One is at the strategic level. This means that to consider how social protection could be better integrated in the strategic plans of the climate funds, considering that there is at the moment poor understanding of social protection by climate finance communities, that there is a need to strengthen the systems at a national level, and that there is important to understand how social protection at the activity level of climate funds could be also achieved, for example, through inclusion of social protection in readiness and capacity building activities of the climate funds, access modalities, who is accessing climate finance at the moment. We know that mostly finance has been accessed to international entities. The same was our results for the review of the social protection projects by the Green Climate Fund. Most of them has been accessed by international entities. However, it would be very important to ensure access also to national level entities as a providers of social protection. And one last point, I think it is important to flag that at the moment, access to climate finance has been more possible at a sectoral level. So basically having social protection integrated in different sectors, for example, in agriculture, food security or disaster risk reduction sector. So I think that's one of the lessons also from my research. Yeah, thank you very much. I will stop here and I welcome questions.
Thank you so much, Dr. Alexandrova. It really stood out to me when you went through basically how the objectives of the UN climate funds are really actually quite aligned with each other. And so trying to build up that coherence and that complementarity of the funds will be integral to trying to see anything come out for social protection. And as well, the objectives of these funds are relevant to social protection as well, although you clearly identify that there's this poor understanding within the climate finance community on social protection and the role it can play. And this issue of knowledge also came up previously in Teresa's presentation on how people in their everyday lives don't even know that they are being supported by a social protection measure. So I think those are very important lessons from your research. Thank you so much for sharing some insights as well to the Loss and Damage Fund, which we know was one of the flagship sort of announcements that came out last year from COP28, and definitely be tuned into COP29 to see if there's anything that can be agreed to with regards to the scope of Loss and Damage Fund, and also very much needed more donations to the fund as well. So in light of that, we've heard about basically the background of social protection, what social protection is, and we've now heard some insights into how financing, how innovative sources of financing could help to strengthen social protection measures and systems that are already active globally. We have invited the African Risk Capacity, Ms. Lusungu Kamudoni, to join us today. We basically have asked her to speak about the African Risk Capacity and what their mandate is on the continent. So as Teresa spoke to before, there are quite a lot of different forms of social protection, but one aspect of it is also social insurance that falls under the social protection sort of umbrella term. And part of this is the risk transferring and reinsurance services that different entities can provide to assist, for example, farmers that face a climate disaster like a huge drought and are unable to gain income from their crop yields. And this is where institutes like the African Risk Capacity can step in. So, Lusungu, you are online. Would you please put on your camera and talk to us a little bit about about how we've heard basically of what social protection is and what it can do for vulnerable and climate change affected communities, and how we can start to interrogate international sources of finance to improve social protection systems. Now, as I mentioned, the African Union recognizes social protection in the Continental Climate Strategy and also in the 10 moonshots of the second 10-year implementation plan of Agenda 2063. Can you take us through how the African Risk Capacity fits into the continent's vision of building climate resilience? Basically, who is the African Risk Capacity and what is your mandate? So over to you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Jordan, for inviting us to be part of this discussion. It's an honor to share the experiences of the African Risk Capacity in contributing to AU agenda in climate resilience. Perhaps let me give you a quick overview of the African Risk Capacity. The ARC, African Risk Capacity, is a treaty-based organization which was created in 2012 by heads of state when they saw the need to put in place a mechanisms that ensures that they are prepared, as well as they also fully understand the risk that they're exposed to put in place timely strategies in responding and taking ownership of the responses when extreme weather events happen. In the context of the AU agenda, ARC actually operates in a number of pathways. One is really supporting the capacities of member states in understanding and quantifying risk through a number of instruments. We have tools and software that supports member states in understanding the risk profiles and the risk that they're exposed to. And based on that risk, we also support member states in putting in place contingency plans which identify interventions or priority response strategies that AU member states can adopt in responding effectively to disasters. There are a number of guiding principles that are very much consistent with what has been shared by the previous speakers that ARC has adopted in ensuring that there's inclusiveness, ensuring that women and children are at the forefront in the responses that are adopted by our member states. One is making sure that we're prioritizing the most vulnerable. So really using existing social protection systems as a pathway to responding to disasters. Two, making sure that on the basis of understanding and monitoring climate risk, the governments explore opportunities of really transferring these risks to the markets through our affiliate Africa Risk Capacity Limited, which provides financial tools and instruments where member states can participate in risk pools and transfer this risk through an insurance mechanism to the markets. And once these risk pools provide payouts to our member states, really taking a proactive approach in putting in place and identifying most vulnerable communities, ensuring that these are prioritized in terms of response, but also exploring existing social protection mechanisms and using the payouts as a means of strengthening and scaling up these social protection mechanisms. Beyond that, ARC ensures that government takes its own leadership, African governments being proactive and taking their own leadership in really understanding and putting in place strategies that respond proactively to extreme weather events. It is on this understanding that timely response and effective response that targets the most vulnerable really provides the necessary cushion to those that are most vulnerable and prevents them from going into negative coping schemes, but also reduces the financial burdens to our member states, really understanding that there are multiple instruments to effectively respond to disasters. There's need to put in place a number of comprehensive instruments that respond to different layers of risk. So really using this as a pathway of risk financing, but also through contingency planning, making sure that on the basis of the risk, there are already proactive measures of really understanding potential interventions that member states can undertake. Now, the Africa Risk Capacity is really a two-tier organization. We have Africa Risk Capacity Agency, which provides sovereign functions to its member states, really by proactively engaging our member states and providing early warning, risk analysis, but also risk quantification tools to member states so that they're able to understand their risk exposure, but also use that as an objective basis to identify potential response interventions that can be undertaken. And the identification of potential interventions is done through contingency planning. So prior to members participating in our risk pools, it is mandatory that all member states that participate in ARC risk pools undergo the risk assessment and risk understanding through our tools and modeling technology, but also through the contingency planning, really go through a detailed exercise of identifying, operational bottlenecks, what are the institutional arrangements within the government structures that can be used effectively to respond to disasters. And only when these are in place, then countries can participate in the risk transfer schemes that the Africa Risk Capacity provides through its affiliate, the Africa Risk Capacity Limited. And I think that you will agree with me, as well as the previous speakers, that we have seen an increased frequency of extreme weather events, and for us, as well as our member states, is really underscores the importance of putting in place pre-agreed measures, because we are aware that these events will keep on happening at a much frequent rate and also with bigger intensity. And one solution alone or waiting for humanitarian assistance may not be sufficient. So really, the governments are taking a proactive approach by really pulling their risk and exploring the transfer of these risks to insurance markets. So ARC agency maintains ongoing dialogue with our member states, as well as providing the necessary capacity in really early warning, understanding of risk, and also exploring and putting in place proactive strategies that help them respond to those risks.
Thanks so much, Lusungu, for sort of setting out and framing out the mandate of ARC on the continent. As just a follow-up, I wanted to ask you, because when we contacted you to participate in this webinar, you mentioned that you are actually currently on assignment. There is a devastating drought unfolding across Southern Africa. So can you please tell us about some of the work that ARC is doing to support governments currently affected by this drought?
Absolutely. I think you may have followed the events that have happened in the 2023-2024 agricultural season, particularly for Southern Africa, where the impacts of El Nino have really impacted the availability of sufficient rainfall for crop production. And this has resulted in an extreme drought, which has affected a number of our member states. We have also seen a number of countries, Malawi, Zambia, and Zimbabwe, make an official declaration of really a drought emergency. And some of the member states participated in the Africa risk pools for the 2023 based on the understanding of the outlook of the season at the beginning of the season last year. And these countries will be benefiting from a total payout of about $62 million, which has been designed to really take early action to provide the countries with early financing that will enable the countries undertake early action as the governments are mobilizing the rest of the response. So in terms of our responsibility in the current response beyond financing, we have been working directly with our disaster management authorities, as well as all the humanitarian actors within the governments, to really put in place effective response strategies by really identifying areas that have been hit the most, but also understanding the vulnerabilities that lie in those areas to ensure that when the payout is disbursed to the member states, there's a swift response on the ground that is tailored towards the most affected and most vulnerable households. And in a way, really scaling up the social protection systems. A few of our member states are actually using existing social protection systems as an avenue for the current response by providing a scale up, whether horizontally or vertically, to those that are already registered on the social protection program through cash transfers, through food assistance, but also providing a horizontal expansion for those that are not have not been recruited on these programs, to make sure that the response is as inclusive as possible, but also takes women and children as understands the vulnerabilities of women and children, as well as other vulnerable groups, as priorities to be responded to.
Thank you so much. I mean, the previous comments from both Teresa and Dr. Alexandrova spoke to the challenges related to financing. So it's such a promising initiative that ARC undertakes to provide this emergency funding to member states. But I just wanted to find out if there are any other obstacles that African countries need, or African states need to address in order to improve their climate resilience. I know that currently ARC is not able to gather data or provide these risk transferring services to all member states. Member states have to first sign the ARC establishment agreement. So are there any other avenues that you guys have identified to maybe get them to opt in to sign the establishment agreement, or other ways of improving climate resilience? You can answer the question, or maybe I should rephrase it for you. We just haven't.
Sorry, I had lost you for a moment.
Okay.
Yes, absolutely. I think that there are a number of limitations that our member states face. First, of course, is the financing. As much as we have our member states participating in the risk pools, but of course, because of resource constraints, we have never had cases where they have sufficiently transferred the risk to the market. So really, as a way of addressing this, ARC has put in place a replica program, which also invites humanitarian actors within the governments to really complement the insurance package that our governments are taking in really addressing part of the risk that perhaps our member states have not been able to fully transfer. We have, for example, in Zimbabwe, we have a network of non-governmental organizations, START Network, that has undertaken insurance to complement the government efforts, and it also will be receiving a payout this year. We have World Food Program in a number of countries. We have World Food Program in Zimbabwe, in Zambia, as well as Mozambique, as to complement the government efforts. But beyond this, I think that there are also some operational limitations. I think the previous speakers have alluded to some of the challenges that the social protection systems have. We have sometimes where social protection has been used as an avenue for response, we have faced challenge in terms of its coverage to be able to sufficiently be used as a tool, a shock responsive tool. So the numbers of people that are recruited on these programs, but also how often this is reviewed, it has not been consistent across member states, and as a way of supporting that, ARC is also exploring ways of really looking at project financing to support the strengthening of these social protection systems for them to be able to be effectively used as avenues of response. But also more broadly, I think that we encourage our member states to really look at risk in a comprehensive way and utilize a number of instruments, really understanding the different layers of risk, where they understand their capacities and the levels of risk that they can sufficiently retain, but also beginning to explore other avenues. Insurance is one of them, but also going beyond insurance to have a comprehensive basket of tools that enables them to respond effectively when these extreme weather events happen.
Thank you so much, Lusungu, for speaking about ARC and sort of educating people to what African initiatives currently exist to build resilience on the continent. I'm now going to open the Q&A. We have received a few Q&A questions, and these are, they haven't been specifically posed to any one speaker. So all speakers are very much welcome to provide their inputs where you feel like you want to share your expertise. So I will start with a question from Paula Castro. She says, would any of the speakers be able to elaborate on the role of social protection in mitigation specifically? So, for example, around the just transition, and also how can climate vulnerable countries find the funding to cover these programs? I don't know which speaker wants to go first. You can just unmute through several.
Yeah, I'd be very happy to talk about that. Thanks very much. It is really, actually, yeah, we focused on the role of social protection to cope with climate impacts, but social protection has actually been a very, very key part of labor unions thinking as a strategy for mitigation. In fact, when we did this report on social protection to address loss and damage, we had also been thinking and engaging a lot with the unions. The concept of just transition is really key. And this also maybe even speaks a little bit to Zach's question about how to go beyond protecting people to transforming and addressing vulnerability in the first place. We all know that fossil fuels, for example, are a major cause of the climate crisis, and that polluting countries need to move away from fossil fuels, and even African countries should ideally be supported to leapfrog or also move away from fossil fuels. So South Africa is a clear example where there's a large coal mining industry. Of course, mining communities themselves, they're often, facing deep inequalities, very precarious living. Life is not easy if you're a coal miner in South Africa. So there can be understandable concern that climate action would undermine your own livelihoods, which can feel deeply unfair when you're already living on the edge. So it's not appropriate that climate action deepens inequality. So how do we get through that? How do we make it fair? Social protection is a really key way to unlocking resistance to climate action and finding pathways forward. So just transition is a concept that really talks about making sure that communities who are already, on the front lines and already facing challenges get to participate in shaping alternative futures, for example, moving away from coal mining, get to identify what a better alternative would be, and receive the support, whether it's training, reskilling, and livelihood support as they transition from one to another, income support. So that kind of thing could be really key, and it has been identified as by unions as really key to a just transition approach. So social protection really really helps us make sure that as we take climate action, we're not overburdening the people who are already incredibly vulnerable, and really helps make sure that action, addresses inequality rather than exacerbating it. The question on finding the funding to cover social protection. I mean, I touched on this a bit, but I would like to elaborate a bit more, actually. Firstly, the international climate finance, as Maria was talking about, the Loss and Damage Fund and the Grief Climate Fund, these should play a greater role. There should be far more international climate finance. We know that the current target of international climate finance to be provided by rich countries to developing countries is $100 billion a year. That's minimal. I mean, that's really not very much at all. It may sound like a lot, but actually, considering we're talking about a climate crisis and stopping runaway climate change, it's almost nothing. When you put it in comparison to the fact that the world's on track to eat $100 billion a year of ice cream by the end of this decade, you realize that $100 billion a year to pay for all of our planetary climate action is really just a joke. So we need to be talking trillions, not billions, for climate finance. And the other problem with current climate finance is like 2/3 of it is actually in the form of loans, which actually deepens countries' debt and often even creates perverse incentives for vulnerable countries to expand their fossil fuel or harmful industrial agriculture in order to repay those climate finance debts. So there's a very messed up system going on with climate finance. This year we have a new opportunity at COP29 is the new collective quantified goal on climate finance, NCQG, which we can just call the new climate finance goal. That is to be negotiated. It's tough negotiations, but we need to be talking about this new goal being in the trillions, not the billions, and being in grants, not loans, because then we should be able to unlock the kind of finance needed for social protection and just transition, as well as adaptation and loss and damage. Other sources of finance, like I touched on debt relief, but to unpack that a little bit more, we've done research that shows that 93% of the most climate vulnerable countries are in or at risk of debt distress. So that means these countries are already prioritizing their national revenue to pay banks in the global north rather than providing their own citizens with essential services, public services, and climate action, including social protection. Now, when disasters happen, at the very least, there should be debt relief in the immediate aftermath so that revenue that's already been raised and would be scheduled to be repaid to banks in the north and the World Bank and the IMF, that can be kept domestically to help bridge a crisis. But really, debt cancellation is a far more just and fair way of dealing with this, because most of these countries have actually already paid their debt, repaid the debt many times over. It's just that the finish line is constantly out of reach because of currency changes and new climate disasters and dynamics like this. So debt cancellation can be really an effective strategy. But also we got to start talking about tax as a really key part. Tax justice as a key climate solution. We know that well, actually, probably not many people are aware that the OECD, which is the Club of Rich Countries, actually controls the global framework on taxes. And to put it in a simple way, that those rules prevent African countries in large part applying taxes to multinational corporations that are extracting their resources back to the north. This is, this is ongoing colonialism happening, every day through a global framework decided by the rich countries. It's absolutely shocking. And when people realize it, they're like, how is that even possible? Well, the good news is that the African group of negotiators last year really won a major win in the UN General Assembly to get an agreement to set up a new global framework, a new UN tax convention on taxes. And if that rolls out, it has to roll out, and countries need, in that all countries should have like an equal voice. Fingers crossed that will create the option for African countries to get out from under this yoke that they have and start taxing international corporations and elites fairly and raising their revenue, because domestic revenue is really a key way to start paying for these services, because right now they're being exploited to the hilt and unable to cover that cost. So much of this action does need to happen at international level, and that's why we've all got to raise our voices to these case bases, including the UN Tax Convention, the IMF and the World Bank for debt relief, and the UN climate negotiations.
Thank you so much for that sort of comprehensive answer to already 2 of our questions. I think there's another one from Paula that I might pose to both Dr. Alexandrova and even to Lusungu, if she'd like to jump in. Paula says, we have seen G7 countries pushing public-private partnership insurance schemes instead of loss and damage financing. Is this really appropriate? So I don't know if maybe you want to take a stab there, Dr. Alexandrova.
Maybe I can jump in first to also add to what Teresa already mentioned. So under the UN climate change regime, there is also a work program on just transitions. So there are also ongoing negotiations on how any activities developed under this program, any ambition developed under this program will be also funded. So we are still to see, I mean, that's really critical, but it's also very difficult to make progress on financing just transition at the moment under the UN climate change regime. Also, what Teresa has mentioned, there are many critical issues that comes to climate finance. There is also another initiative at the global level. I'm not that familiar at what is the status at the moment, but there is global accelerator on jobs and social protection for just transition, which was launched by the UN Secretary General, and I think ILO is quite engaged in this. So that's the objective of the accelerator, is exactly to support just transition in partner countries. And maybe I can just share a few some of the findings on just transition related funding through the GCF. So we did not, as I have mentioned, we did not find any mitigation-only project supported by the GCF that points to investment in social protection. However, we have identified that there are projects that could potentially be advanced to do that, and this includes to energy efficiency in the housing sector, in the social housing sector. It is also include to projects that relate to environmental protection, forest restoration, where we see a lot of mitigation benefits. So there are, I posted in the chat the publication for those who are interested. There is a list of all the projects that we could identify, and one can learn a bit more. And when it comes to the question about insurance and loss and damage, this is indeed a very a very debated question. So basically, insurance is an important element to address the climate crisis. However, there are a lot of limitations. So starting from insurance coverage to climate justice, who should pay for the climate impacts. Probably Teresa will say more about the insurance, but yeah, there are limitations. So insurance cannot cover all risks. Insurance coverage remains low, especially for the most vulnerable people. And these are the most critical issues that have been discussed also in the context of loss and damage finance. Yeah, so I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I think before I bring Teresa back in, I just want to see if Lusungu wants to respond. There's also another question saying that it's interesting to understand what opportunities there are for private sector involvement in social protection in Africa. And an example was given of microfinance services like insurances and loans directly to small-scale farmers. And if there are any successful examples of this that maybe Lusungu, you as ARC have come across.
Yeah, thank you very much. Perhaps to respond to the effectiveness of insurance, I think our advocacy has always been that member states should look at a more comprehensive approach in risk financing strategies. Insurance alone, of course, is not sufficient, but it's a critical component to address risks that are less frequent in occurrence. And really, we, in support of really having our member states develop risk financing strategies that look at a number of instruments and really identify the most optimal risk that can utilize insurance as a response mechanism. But not to say that insurance alone will address all the needs. Of course, we also understand the limitation in really understanding risk as a potential avenue in responding to as a means of really responding to disaster management. In the African context, it's a relatively new phenomenon that may not be sufficiently understood, and is part of our responsibility also as African risk capacity in really enhancing the knowledge of our member states in understanding that insurance is one of the instruments that can be utilized. And to concur with some of the limitations that our member states have in premium financing, and even the uptake of insurance itself, the ARC also facilitates opportunities for member states to access premium financing from different partners. So our member states most of the member states that have participated in our programs have also accessed support in premium financing to make sure that there is sufficient enough coverage for its most vulnerable populations.
Thank you so much.
Can I, Jordan, only add? Sorry, I just wanted to add, because what Lusungu is saying is also very important, and I agree. I just want to flag also the role of social protection. So there are projects funded by climate funds and by other sources of finance that link social protection with insurance. So basically providing premium coverage or subsidies for most vulnerable groups to access insurance. So I just wanted to highlight this link, because it was not mentioned previously how social protection could support access to insurance.
And I think Teresa, you may have a few more points to add, maybe just to round out our Q&A.
Yeah, I think the point about the G7 countries pushing insurance instead of loss and damage, that refers to a few years ago, we saw a really cynical push actually by the wealthy countries, particularly during the Sharm el-Sheikh COP, and even the year before that, where they were trying to say, no, we don't need loss and damage funding. We don't need to set up a new loss and damage fund. We have insurance schemes. The Global Shield insurance scheme will be fine. But there was huge anger actually at how that was being proposed as an alternative to real loss and damage funding, because I mean, we know that it is those countries, the G7 countries, who've done the most to cause the climate crisis, you know, through a century or more of pollution and extraction. And they kept pointing to this Global Shield insurance scheme, which is they called that, but theoretically it was like a connection of different regional insurance schemes, you know, backstopped by private insurance companies. Basically, it was a privatized scheme that was controlled for private insurance companies, you know, who do need to make profit to exist. So the question is always, you know, public funds and private partnerships, you know, they have potential, but where does the money really go and how much really reaches communities is always going to be a question when it comes to public-private partnerships, not least when it comes to Global Shield and insurance. But then, like as others have talked about here, there are real limits to what insurance can really deliver. One of the biggest gaps, of course, is slow onset events, you know, rising sea levels or, you know, desertification and salination. We're seeing lots of examples now where insurance companies are basically flat out refusing to insure people that live on certain coastlines because they know that, you know, it's a guarantee that those impacts will happen, so that there's no economic interest for those insurance companies to take on that risk. And then there's other examples where insurance schemes, including the ARC, have like defined very narrow parametric triggers that will for a payout, and then refuse to pay out when a climate disaster happens, but it didn't fall within those parametric triggers. So certainly the lessons there are that these contracts need to be carefully scrutinized. I'm sure that there's been a lot of lessons learned in the past through trialing these processes, but certainly I would say that African countries engaging in insurance need to very carefully read the small print, because it's not always easy to get a payout in certain circumstances.
Thank you so much. I mean, I think that goes back to what Lusungu was just saying, that insurance is only one component of the sort of entire climate response that we need to look forward to. So I think we have run a bit out of time. I'm going to hand this back over to Joseph just to close us out and say thank you as well to all the speakers for the wonderful and insightful contributions to our webinar today. Thanks, Joseph.
Thanks, Jordan. Just to thank everyone for joining us, and to thank for the speakers, Teresa and Maria, for sharing your research findings on the interaction of gender, climate change, and social protection, and Lusungu for sharing your insights on the work of that ARC is doing, including right now that the Southern African region is facing a drought. These are very important discussions, and I hope we keep having more of them. And thank for everyone who joined, and let me close the meeting for now. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Joseph. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.